Hi, this is Northampton Neighbors Speaker Series, and my name is Sarah Backrack. I'm part of the Speakers Committee, and I volunteer. I'm going to give a short spiel about Northampton Neighbors and the logistics, and then I'll introduce Ellie and Barbara, and we'll get going. So Northampton Neighbors has more than 1,200 members. We provide services and social activities to help us age in our own homes. We don't have any fees for membership or for any of our services. We rely on grants and donations. That's why we had that big slide up before. Today's talk will last 30 to 35 minutes with questions and answers afterwards. If there are still a lot of questions at 4, Barbara and Ellie have agreed to stay for 10 or 15 minutes, but if you need to leave, we understand. Everyone will be muted during the talk. Please put your questions into the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And try to wait till the talk is over unless you have a compelling question, because they may answer your question during their talk. Click on the Otter button in the upper right-hand corner if you want to read along. The talk will be available for viewing if anyone misses it on YouTube without 48 hours. We are recording now. So now I think I got done the logistics. My introduction, Barbara Blumenthal. She's a long-term resident of Northampton, and she graduated from Smith. She's a professional bookbinder, book art historian, rare book specialist at Smith College Mortimer Rare Book Room, and she's also on the board of Historic Northampton. And I see her walking around the neighborhood, so she has a little time walking anyway. Ellie is also a long-term resident in Western Mass. She worked as a nurse practitioner at a children's hospital for 24 years. And then she decided to start a next chapter in her life and became a fiction writer. She's written multiple books and articles, and she's been honored by the Sarton Women's Prize and the Women's National Book Association. And her books are great. I've read them. I think I've read them all. We'll stop for Q&A after about 35 minutes. And so now I'm going to get out of here. We're going to mute everybody, and I'm going to turn it over to Ellie and Barbara.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Northampton Neighbors for inviting us to talk. Thank you all for joining us. Barbara and I are both pretty obsessed about the state hospital. Barbara as a historian and me as a novelist. This afternoon, we're going to offer you 2 approaches to understanding the legacy of Northampton State Hospital: the historical facts as they are recorded, and The Lost Women of Azalea Court, a work of fiction based on those facts, a work of imagination. Our state hospital fact expert, history expert, Barbara, has lived on Hospital Hill for almost 50 years and has been fascinated by the hospital both as a historian and as a neighbor. I'm the fiction person, the one who likes to make stuff up. I've lived in the Village Hill neighborhood for almost 6 years, but my first personal experience with the state hospital occurred 45 years ago. So we've been obsessed, both of us, for quite a long time. The novelist Dalma Llanos Figueroa writes that history reflects life from the outside in. Fiction reflects life from the inside out. One focuses on events, the other on the effect of those events on characters. This afternoon, we will take both approaches: the history from the outside in and a novel from the inside out, looking at characters' voices and emotions, looking at their stories. So we invite you to take a virtual walk with us around the grounds of the former state hospital. We'll make 5 stops: the fountain, the coach house, the community gardens, the burial grounds, and the Haskell building. As we travel and stop, keep in mind the three levels of geographic reality that we're looking at. Superimposed on this map of part of the current Village Hill neighborhood are the outline of Old Main, the first and iconic asylum building shown here in red, and the made-up cul-de-sac of Azalea Court, outlined in green. You know, it's pretty tricky trying to set a novel in your backyard. So I imagined sewing a zipper onto a map of the neighborhood off Prince Street between Musanti Drive and the community gardens. Then I open up this imaginary zipper to reveal Azalea Court, the setting of this novel. At each stop, Barbara will share some of the facts, the history of the place, and then I will read a short excerpt from the novel set in that location. Barbara, to you.
Thanks, Ellie. And I also want to add my thanks to Northampton Neighbors for sponsoring us, and particularly to Ellie, whose idea this was, who said, would you join me? And I really think you're all going to enjoy this. My first little talk is going to be a little longer than my other ones, just because I want to give you some background on the history. Okay, as many of you know, this restored fountain is the centerpiece of a small memorial park on Olander Drive in Village Hill. Although it's missing two tiers, the fountain is on its original site where it was placed in 1876 across from Old Main. You see a little bit of Old Main behind this on the picture. It was also in Ellie's first slide. And this first building at Northampton Lunatic Asylum, which opened in 1858, was a large brick building. It was designed by Thomas Kirkbride, who advocated for relocating mentally ill persons who languished in jails, poorhouses, cellars, and attics, to offer them what they called moral treatment of kindness and compassion. The site for the hospital is just about 1.5 miles from the center of Northampton, on a hill specifically chosen for its beautiful vistas. Kirkbride's building plan offered lots of light, fresh air, and single rooms for patients. He wrote, "The building should be in good taste, and it should impress favorably not only the patients, but their friends and others who may visit it. Yes, the main building was a tourist attraction, its cupola open to the public on Sundays so that they could visit and admire the views. Unfortunately, the high ideals of Northampton State Hospital, its name was changed in 1903, eventually were challenged by overcrowding and other factors. Old Main was expanded on both sides through the early 20th century. But by the early 1960s, the hospital had fallen into disrepair, and with severe staff shortages, it had reverted to custodial care and heavy use of calming medications. At this time, ideas about mental illness and confinement were being reevaluated. And in 1976, the Northampton-based Center for Public Representation filed a class action lawsuit against the Commonwealth on behalf of several state hospital patients. This resulted in a 1978 consent decree agreement, an agreement to gradually discharge patients into community programs to treat patients in the least restrictive environment. The deinstitutionalization process ultimately took 15 years. The hospital closed in August 1993 when the last 12 patients were transferred. As the end drew near, the Commonwealth and the city started making plans for how best to reuse or redevelop the 500 acres of the state hospital campus. A citizens advisory committee was established to consult on a master plan for redevelopment. Early on, a memorandum of understanding required that land be set aside for memorial to the hospital. In 2000, a small group, including some former employees, came forward with the Fountain Project, proposing a memorial to patients featuring the fountain in front of Old Main. In 2007, the CAC finally established an official memorial committee. That committee, of which I was a member, held public listening sessions to determine how best to memorialize the hospital, and indeed restoring the fountain and placing it in a serene park came to the forefront. The memorial park finally was completed and dedicated on June 3rd, 2021, with funding from the Community Preservation Act and many other donors, including residents of Village Hill. We also created a walking tour, which was largely due to the work of Tom Riddell's students at Smith. There are signs dispersed throughout the former hospital campus in Village Hill. The signs reveal the history of the hospital, its buildings, its staff, its patients, as well as observations on the changes in methods to treat mental illness. As Ellie and I said, we're going to just make 5 stops, but I encourage you to visit Village Hill and complete the entire tour yourself.
Thank you, Barbara. When I moved to Village Hill in 2017, I had been working on this novel for a couple of years. It was set elsewhere and it was not going well. One day I read about an inscription that some people wanted to carve into the base of the restored fountain in Memorial Park. Quote, "This is the fountain of all the tears that have been shed at the hospital," unquote. At that moment, the ghosts of the people who lived here started whispering to me, "You should set your story here," it said. I listened to them, and that's when the novel really started to take off. The Lost Women of Azalea Court takes place over 2.5 days in November 2019, 2.5 days leading up to a dedication ceremony for Memorial Park and the fountain. This is 26 years after the last patients left the hospital. It begins when Iris Blum, the 88-year-old wife of Asher Blum, the head psychiatrist at the hospital for the last 40 years, goes missing. The novel centers on these 2 characters, but it's really the story of a group of people who, when faced with loss and fear, find connection to each other. Because this is a story of a group of people, they take turns narrating the novel, 15 of them, including sections that are narrated by a Greek chorus of the women. I'm going to read a section from the very beginning of the book in their collective voice. The women. Everything changed when Iris went missing. Before that morning, if you had asked anyone living in the 6 bungalows on Azalea Court if we were close, we would have rolled our eyes. We respect each other's privacy and stay in our own homes and yards. People often ask us if Azalea Court is cursed. Our small homes sit on the grounds of a former state mental hospital where thousands of lost souls were incarcerated over the course of almost a century and a half, where Dr. Blum, Iris's husband, was the head psychiatrist for decades. Rumor has it that he's writing a book about the hospital. He calls it What We Thought We Knew. And many of us are more than a little worried about what unpleasant publicity it might bring to Azalea Court. If you could see directly into our hearts, you'd know that in addition to the ugly ancient secrets of the hospital, our little street is home to people who have survived all sorts of trauma. But on that Friday morning in November 2019, when Iris went missing, Azalea Court was quietly sliding out of autumn and anticipating winter. It was the last place any of us expected to see police cars and search teams.
The Coach House, also known as the Horse Barn, is the current home of the Conway School of Landscape Design, with some residential apartments above. The Coach House was built in 1900, and it is the oldest original hospital building still standing. It was a stable for the hospital's horses. There was a hayloft above, and carriages and farm implements were stored in the basement. There were patient excursions in those carriages, often to Mount Tom. A large part of treatment in early days included both occupational and physical therapy. Outings in the fresh air were thought to be vital for the easing of troubled minds. In the early 1920s, automobiles supplanted horses in the coach house. But who were the patients who might have enjoyed these outings? During its 135-year history, 65,000 patients were admitted to Northampton State Hospital. Some stayed a few days, while others lived there for 50 years or more. Early on, the patients were primarily white Massachusetts residents, farmers, laborers, domestics, or factory workers. Irish immigrants were sometimes transferred here from overcrowded Boston facilities, and sometimes foreign-born patients outnumbered native-born. There were more women than men. There were numerous causes listed for mental illness. Most frequent were unknown or hereditary, but also alcoholism, poor health, melancholia or depression, domestic trouble, hard labor, religious excitement, postpartum depression, epilepsy, and head injury. It wasn't difficult to commit someone to the asylum. The hospital was a means of social control for people such as the poor, physically disabled, especially deaf persons, immigrants, or deviant women. As one former patient said, the hospital was a convenient place for inconvenient people. In the early 20th century, the patient population became more elderly, with more patients suffering from dementia.
I took this photo of the coach house. The first winter I lived on Village Hill. I took it from my writing desk, looking across Musanti Drive. The hospital affected not only the patients, but also the hundreds of psychiatrists, medical staff, nurses, attendants, social workers, and other workers who often worked here for decades. The narrator of this next excerpt is Evelyn, who lives with her husband, Donnie, in number 3 Azalea Court, next door to Iris and Asher. Donnie inherited number 3 Azalea Court from his mother, who worked for many decades as an attendant at the hospital. This excerpt is from Evelyn's point of view, and I need to give you a trigger warning because there is an assault. So if you want to not listen to this part, go get a drink of water or something. Evelyn. The newspaper photo stared at her from the fridge, its red outline a bullseye on her fears. The brick facade of Old Main looked so solid, but it couldn't protect anyone, inside or out. The ancient copper beeches in front of the building leered at her across the decades, a tree chorus singing, "We saw what happened." Actually, the massive tree trunks had shielded what happened, blocked any possible rescue. It had been spring of 1985. She was 25 years old, a nursing student. She wasn't enthusiastic about psychiatric nursing, but it was her last clinical rotation. How bad could it be? Her neighbor was the head shrink over there, and the rotation was only 6 weeks. She'd been living with Donnie for almost a year and could walk there. Perfect, right? 2 weeks into the rotation, a medical student asked her to help him with a procedure on a patient. She was delighted, relieved to avoid the stench of the locked ward, a witch's brew of mildew and urine and bleach. The med student was about her age, and she listened intently as he explained the procedure as they walked to the treatment room in another building. It was a sunny day, warm enough to leave her jacket behind as they walked across the grass to a small brick building. She wondered where the patient was. She should have suspected, should have known there was no patient. By the time they were inside and she understood what was happening, the med student had locked the door of the coach house, had his hand over her mouth and a knee pushing under her clean white student nurse uniform. All these years later, she never forgot the horsey smell of the dirt floor, garlic on his breath, and then garlic spit on her arm where he bit her when he finished. Donnie tried to be supportive, but he thought she should be over it by now. Why should one unwanted sexual encounter be so huge, he kept asking. It wasn't a matter of shame, not really. She knew it wasn't her fault. She reported the attack to her instructor and the hospital administration. That afternoon reinforced her decision to avoid medical institutions of any kind, to take care of people in the haven of their homes, although she had since learned that some homes weren't much of a refuge. She shook herself out of her memories. The hospital memorial dedication was in 2 days. Even though she knew that reliving old pain wasn't healthy, she couldn't stop her brain from going back. She needed to get out of the house and do something useful. She knew Iris, and Iris trusted her. If anyone could find the woman, she would be that person.
The Northampton Community Gardens are just a part of the hundreds of acres of land from the former hospital, which have been preserved from development and protected as agricultural and recreational land. In 1990, the Commonwealth declared the fields along the Mill River, in an area that a lot of people call the dog park, as permanent agricultural land. These fields are leased to Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School, which most people around here know as Smith Voc. The community gardens can be seen as a legacy of the robust farm operated at the hospital from its opening until the late 1950s. For decades, the hospital was self-sufficient and also sold surplus food raised there. Some patients worked alongside outside hired workers on the farm, which was considered part of their healing process. In 1864, Pliny Earle, second superintendent of the hospital, stressed the importance of physical work by able-bodied patients to bring psychological benefits and a sense of accomplishment. The coach house was one of a dozen or more farm and support buildings at the hospital. The hospital was self-sufficient in many ways. Patients and staff were fed, buildings maintained, laundry done, among other things. Most of the support buildings were made of brick and clustered behind or west of Old Main. They included the piggery, built in 1886. The hospital was famous for what was known as the hospital breed, and raising of pigs actually continued until 1966. Also the hennery for various types of poultry, the red barn, the storehouse, the ox barn, pump house, firehouse, the laundry, which was later established on Earl Street, and various sheds. In 1939, this is a list of the following crops harvested from the hospital's farm: hay, feed corn, apples, strawberries, asparagus, beets, cabbage, cantaloupes, carrots, sweet corn, cucumbers, dandelions, onions, parsnips, rhubarb, summer squash, winter squash, tomatoes, turnips, eggs, chicken, pork, and milk. We can all look forward to spring.
So Iris goes missing on a Friday. Saturday morning, after the drones and dogs have unsuccessfully done their jobs looking for her, neighbors are allowed to organize search parties around the neighborhood, including the community gardens adjacent to Azalea Court. This next excerpt is narrated by one of the other neighbors on the court, a woman named Gandalf, who is searching in the gardens with her partner, Jess, and with Lexi, the middle-aged daughter of the missing woman, Iris. Gandalf: was this a good idea, walking around the gardens with the missing woman's daughter? She and Jess didn't have very many friends, and Gandalf knew that was her fault. So having another person to walk and talk with, even someone whose mother was missing and possibly worse, was welcome in a twisted kind of way. I walked through the gardens yesterday, Lexi said. I didn't see any sign of my mother, but we'll take a closer look. Do your parents have a garden plot? Jess asked. Lexi shook her head. Mom loved to grow flowers in the yard, but she's arthritic and can't do much anymore. They reached the gravel road circling the 7 acres of garden, carved by footpaths into square plots. They walked in silence. Some plots were neat, with dead plant material removed and rake marks visible in the partly frozen soil. Others sprouted brown stalks, dead leaves, and the occasional shriveled tomato or pepper. Mom, Lexi called out, Mom, are you here? Not many places a person could find shelter here, are they? Jess commented. Lexi's face crumpled. She gets cold so easily. She'll freeze out here if we don't find her. Jess put her arm around Lexi and hugged her. For the 100th time in their lives together, Gandalf wished she could be as spontaneously warm as Jess. What about that? Jess pointed to an overgrown plot containing a wooden structure. It could have once been a grape arbor or perhaps a greenhouse abandoned to the elements. Black plastic was draped across the top and sides and nailed down, but one loose piece flapped in the chilly wind. Lexi picked her way between tall stalks that might have grown Brussels sprouts. She lifted the blowing edge and peered inside. Anything? Jess asked. Just tools and buckets, Lexi said. I keep trying to understand, but I just don't know what Mom was thinking, leaving the house like that. Lexi stopped walking. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you think it was her dementia? Jess asked. Lexi stopped walking and turned to face Jess. I'm not convinced my mother has dementia. Her symptoms started too suddenly. I've been reading about Alzheimer's. This, whatever it is that my mother has, doesn't feel right. What are you saying? What do you think happened? Gandalf asked. Not really wanting an answer that would involve her and Jess more with this woman and her family and their problems. I don't know, Lexi said, but I think her disappearance may have something to do with my father.
Let me remind you of a former patient's comment that the hospital was a convenient place for inconvenient people. Sadly, at many such institutions, people were admitted for reasons other than diagnosed mental illness, sometimes because their families couldn't handle them or just didn't want them around. And sometimes at Northampton State Hospital, when a patient died, there was no one to claim their body. The site you see here is known as Cemetery Hill. It is a burial ground of unknown boundaries with at least 181 unmarked graves of unidentified patients who died at the hospital between 1858 and 1921. We know the burial ground's location through oral history and archaeological consultation. There has been a memorial here, a bench with flanking trees, since the 1950s. More recently, the Northampton Historical Commission has worked with faculty and students from Smith Folk to oversee and maintain the site. In 2016, a new stone bench was placed here. New oak trees were planted to replace declining yews. Also marking the site is a stone obelisk, which was once a gate post for a metal fence that completely surrounded the hospital grounds. A plaque on the obelisk reads in part, "This bench provides a place of repose and is dedicated to the memory of those individuals, known and unknown, interred on this hillside." After 1921, deceased patients were buried at other locations in Northampton, including Spring Grove Cemetery in Florence. Ongoing projects aim to create recognition of this and to place some sort of memorial there.
Shortly after I moved to Village Hill, I attended the dedication ceremony for this new granite bench overlooking the burial ground. It was during that ceremony, which was incredibly moving, that I knew for certain that this book would be set in this place. The narrator of this next section is Gloria. Gloria doesn't actually live on Azalea Court. She's a homeless woman who parks her car near the community gardens. Gloria. Gloria couldn't stop thinking about the missing woman. It was different from her own situation, of course, but it made her anxious to think about anyone wandering around lost, unable to go home, or having nowhere to go. If the woman had dementia, would she be able to find a warm place to shelter, or would she freeze to death among last year's broken corn stalks? How ironic to end a long and useful life in this place where so many poor souls lived and died and were buried in unmarked graves because no one knew how to calm their demons. Sometimes she would walk the overgrown path by the river, its entrance mostly hidden by thick laurel bushes. An ancient weather-beaten sign announced in hand-drawn letters that this was Rebecca's way. Who was Rebecca? Gloria often wondered, and what happened to her? On sunny days, if she felt especially safe, Gloria would leave the security of her car and sit on the new bench at the edge of the burial ground. She'd think about all the nameless patients interred there a century ago, not only the ones who were mentally ill, but also the inconvenient people, the unwed mothers, the disobedient wives, the lost, the poor, the homeless, like her. If the state hospital were still open, she herself might be swept up and incarcerated. She could end up buried in that field.
I'm at least one person who considers it ironic that the Haskell building remains untouched and was never part of the hospital redevelopment plans. I'll say politely, it's the least attractive of the more than 40 buildings once on the hospital campus. Only 5 original buildings, Haskell, the coach house, the male attendants home, the nurses home, and the South employees home remain. And Haskell is still used by the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. Since 3 of the remaining original buildings were constructed to house staff members, I'll talk a bit about employees. Many lived on site in these apartments, and others, often multiple generations of one family, lived in the surrounding neighborhood. As the number of patients grew and new wards were added to the hospital, staff residences and dormitories were built on the hospital grounds between 1928 and 1932 to attract qualified staff. The nurses' home for female nurses is now Hilltop East Apartments. Female employees also lived in the South employees' homes, which was renovated as Hilltop West Apartments. At the north end of Old Main, which then stretched all the way across the top of Hospital Hill, was the North employees' home, built in 1920 for male employees, and after 1930, it became housing for married employees. The number of workers living on hospital grounds declined through the 1960s and 1970s, and the last occupants moved out in 1984. The male attendants home, which is next to the Haskell building, was the last major residence constructed. It was renovated as condominiums, now called the Columns at Rockwell Place. There were covered walkways and underground tunnels that connected many of the hospital buildings. Unfortunately, the stigma of mental illness carried over somewhat to the employees at the hospital. They formed a tight-knit community, and even after the hospital closed, many employees remained close with each other and with former patients. There were social activities, including bowling leagues, baseball teams, dances, and shows. Many employees felt they were doing the best they could under the circumstances. Quote, "We were nothing but a group of down-to-earth people having a hell of a good time, taking care of people that nobody else wanted, unquote. Another comment from an employee concerns family members who did care. People in the community just thought that anyone who was up here was crazy and violent, and that was just not true. Our society at that time thought that if people are mentally ill, you put them away somewhere and forget about them. But there were other people. I remember on Friday nights, the families would come and take their patients home and back on Sunday night.
On this last stop, we return to Gandalf's point of view. Like several of the other residents of Azalea Court, Gandalf had a traumatic past. This scene takes place later in the book. Gandalf. Gandalf was grateful that Jess had stopped objecting to her nighttime walks, especially now. Their neighborhood had always been safe, was probably still safe, even with the unsolved mystery of Iris's disappearance. She loved walking alone in the dark, up and down the half-dozen streets, mostly named after former city mayors. Such an odd concept, turning a failed healing enterprise into ordinary homes. Sometimes she thought it was creepy and disrespectful. Other times, it felt perfectly reasonable to recycle grief and regret into the commonplace pleasures of domestic life. Her nighttime walking never varied. The same streets in the same order. Her footsteps led her brain down the well-known sidewalks, and the motion calmed her synapses. She hummed tunelessly, not aware of any true melody, a gentle accompaniment to her footsteps. It usually took an hour for the walking to bring her to a place of peace. Leaving the row of attached townhouses, she followed the curved driveway in front of the Haskell building and turned right along the parking lot and loading dock. Haskell was where the last patients lived in the final years before the state hospital was closed. It was her least favorite part of the neighborhood walk, and she always hurried past the building, ugly and solemn in its brick face and harsh lines. Some nights, more rarely now, the bars on the Haskell windows sucked her back to her own incarceration. There were years after she escaped from Hurricane Island when she worried that she would end up someplace like this hospital, although probably a more privileged version. When she and Jess first moved to town, Gandalf read every book in the Forbes Library about the hospital, about the lack of evidence-based treatments, about the women who were committed because their husbands were tired of them, about the homosexuals locked up to protect society from their contagion. If she'd been born a century earlier, she easily could have ended up on the other side of those barred windows. When a shape moved on the loading dock, briefly visible against the garage door, Gandalf stopped walking. She had never seen anybody here before. The dog walkers mostly kept to the streets. The shadow must have seen her too, because it stopped and slunk back, disappearing into the dark behind a dumpster. She resumed walking, but stopped again when she heard sobbing. From the shadow on the dock? She should keep walking, or she'd never fall asleep. But when she got home and told Jess about it, Jess would ask, "How could you just walk by? Didn't you check to make sure somebody wasn't hurt?" Reluctantly, she walked toward the dock. "Hello?" she called out, hoping hard that no one would answer. "Are you okay?"
So I came to Northampton in 1971 as a freshman at Smith College. And I'm in the right-hand picture, I'm the young girl on the left with the glasses. I became aware that there was a state hospital on the hill beyond Smith's athletic fields. I married at the end of my junior year, and my husband and I lived on the other side of the railroad tracks for a year and a half. Then we moved to the Hospital Hill neighborhood in 1976, and we're still here in that same house. Our deed research revealed that our house was built around 1860. It was briefly owned by Dr. William Henry Prince, who was the first superintendent of Northampton Lunatic Asylum, although I didn't really make that connection for many years. Not surprisingly, there were many hospital connections in my neighborhood, including my next door neighbors, Claude and Priscilla Hill. Claude had already retired from years as an attendant at the hospital, and Priscilla had established a library for patients there. Down the street lived Jackie Duda, who was a nurse who had worked at the hospital, helping to find placements for geriatric patients. Jackie was also part of the Fountain Project and the subsequent Memorial Committee. Many members of the Elliott family lived near me on Rust Avenue, and many worked at the hospital. One of them, Bob Elliott, was a bookbinder, and because I'm a bookbinder, he showed me my one small tour of a section of the tunnels I mentioned before, because there was a bindery under the memorial complex, and he showed me that after the hospital had closed. My husband and I walked on the hospital grounds and down to the river long before official trails were created. All of this to say, I've long been interested in the history of the hospital.
Like Barbara, I have personal history with the state hospital. In 1977, 1 year before the consent decree, I was a student nurse doing my psych rotation at Northampton State Hospital. That's me in the middle on the photo on the left. I was physically assaulted by a patient and then later threatened with rape and murder by another patient. I wasn't harmed, and I did what fiction writers do. I gave my experience, made much more dramatic, of course, to a character. That's one way that storytelling both honors and reimagines history. We create connections with people who might be different from ourselves as an attempt to deeply understand the emotional truths of a place and a story. If you'd like to learn more about the state hospital, there are a bunch of resources here, which Nina will put into the chat. The historical truths are complicated, and certainly the legacy of Northampton State Hospital is. We would like at this point to open the conversation to your questions and your comments. As Sarah said, put your questions into the chat, please. And I will stop the share here so we can see each other a little better.
I'm going to jump in now.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I wish it could go on for a few hours. We found that in Zoom, we can't clap, so we can sort of shake our hands and say it was wonderful. Just before we start the questions and get the answers, I just want to say that our next speaker is Kelsey Flynn on improv on April 14th, and then Sophie Berman on Angels and Ghosts on May 5th. I'm going to start with a question, I think, for Ellie, although I don't quite understand the question. Jane asked it. Hearing voices may have been the reason people were admitted to the mental health hospital, yet we yearn to hear those voices of those inside. How are we different? How are we different from them?
Well, I think that's a great question. We probably are not different from them. You know, it was the othering of people with mental illness that was part of the reason that people were put away and locked away and not able to remain part of the society of the town. You know, I think the fact that we have not known and still know nowhere near enough about the causes of mental illness or how to best treat mental illness, that we're in this situation. But no, I think we are that the people who were committed to the state hospital and locked away are probably not so different from many of us.
And I could just add something quickly. It's sort of secondhand, but personal, because my husband Joe worked for a year and a half as an attendant at a hospital, a mental hospital in Baltimore. And of course, there were locked wards, and so he's an attendant. He has all keys. But he said there was this thin line, and he felt like the only thing that was different about them was that he had the keys and the patients didn't. Well, that's maybe not phrased right, but that there was a very thin line.
Barbara, Mark Carpel asks, please talk about the moral treatment, the unusual treatment used in the 19th century at the hospital involving the emphasis on farming and handiwork. You mentioned it briefly, but.
Right, it wasn't really that unusual. It was a movement that was done in a number of hospitals. And this Thomas Kirkbride, who was superintendent in a Pennsylvania hospital, was one of the proponents of it. And it was more that if you remove someone from where they're living and having trouble for whatever reason, and you bring them to this beautiful place and you occupy their mind, and you have occupational therapy, so they're occupying literally themselves. One, I think it was sort of that you don't have as much time to dwell inside yourself and focus on your problems, and that will just help to heal you. But it was also being kind. I mean, there was people in mental institutions. I mean, often they were in jails if they were mentally ill. So people were chained up and not treated well. And this really was trying to treat them like people and with respect. And in Old Main, initially, the patients and the doctors lived in the same building as well.
Okay, for maybe both of you, either of you, why do we think that closing these hospitals was so terrific when now we have so many people who are living on the street and homeless today?
I don't know the answer to that. I know that in the 1970s, when the consent decree was established, I was in Northampton State Hospital as a student nurse just for several weeks, and it was pretty horrible. The overcrowding was extensive. The use of the psych meds that left people just really so sedated that they couldn't function appeared to be the major treatment, and that seemed to be primarily because they were able to be, they didn't make trouble that way. So, you know, I don't know from the point of view of the psychiatric staff what they felt about it at that time, but from the point of view of a student nurse and of the patients and families that I've had an opportunity to speak with, closing the hospital did feel like the right thing to do.
And for many people, it probably was the right thing to do to be somewhere else. But I think that when it happened, even though it took 15 years for the hospital to finally close after the consent decree, that the Commonwealth, you know, didn't really step up to make sure there were programs and housing for people, which is part of what started the maybe seeing more homeless people on the streets of Northampton. So that it has to go hand in hand. I know now there's a shortage of inpatient psychiatric units, and not everyone can be treated as an outpatient. So it's as I said, it's just a mixed bag. It was good for some people, wasn't good for others, and just wasn't really thought through by the Commonwealth and the Department of Mental Health.
Francine asks if there's any memoirs that have been written, and I'm going to destroy his name, but Ed Chakowski said he did write a memoir with one of the former patients, and he talks about it a bit, but he asks at the end, besides the memorial fountain, are there any other artifacts or records, etc.?
I can start with that and say that, yes, there are some artifacts at Historic Northampton. There are and there are other websites which collect information. Tom Riddell taught a course, I don't know, probably for 6 or 7 years to first-year students at Smith, titled it's either the evolution and transformation of the Northampton State Hospital, or it might be reversed, those two words. And they collect a lot of material. There's a wonderful website from them. Christopher Sparks has set up a website. A lot of people, including Mark Rossler, took a lot of pictures, both illegally and legally, of some of the buildings. Also Anna Schulite, who is a performance artist, but some of you may remember that I think it was the year 2000, she had a conference on mental illness here, which culminated with people coming up the hill and walking, standing outside of Old Main while Bach's Magnificat was broadcast out of speakers that had been set up in the building. So there's been a lot of documentation, and I don't know if we have enough of maybe we can add them and Northampton Neighbors can distribute them, some of the other websites, and there's certainly literature written by both doctors and psychologists about the hospital. Mm-hmm. The records are available, the annual reports are available also.
Yeah.
That's it goes. Oh.
Let me just add a little bit. Ed's memoir is actually with a former patient of Belchertown State School, not of the Northampton State Hospital. It's called You'll Like It Here, and it's a really amazing book. And there certainly are some really similar themes between Belchertown and the state hospital, even though they supposedly were for different categories of individuals. The other thing is that both the Forbes Library, local history room, and Historic Northampton have amazing archives that a lot of original material, photographs and text about the hospitals, and are really worth looking at. Yes.
Okay, Holly, I think her last name is Cregan, said her great-grandmother was committed there and died there in 1927. And she lived in Northampton and she graduated from Smith. And she's tried to get records from that period. How do you access them? And that merges with another question. Leads for records as recent as 1950. This is from Barbara Bricker. They have a cousin who was an inmate then, and they've hit a brick wall trying to find those records.
Historic Northampton is the place where I've seen some records, but I wasn't looking for individual patient records, so I don't know whether or not those are there. With HIPAA now, it's hard to know exactly what might be available even for family members.
Okay. I can't tell who this is. It's just their web address, but they said so far there's a lot of references to the distant past about the reforms, but nothing about the reforms or improvements in the 70s until the hospital closed. Whoops, I'm missing part of it. Hold on a second. In his 15 years of employment as a psychologist there, his opinion is the institution should not have closed. So that's a comment. But then someone has asked, has anyone ever been held accountable for the crimes that happen here?
I don't know that anybody's been held accountable. And, my research, both in archives and in doing interviews with quite a few psychologists, social workers, families, is that the huge majority of the people who work there did so wanting to help people and doing the very best they could to help people in an overcrowded, underfunded situation where really good answers just didn't seem to be available. I'm sure that there were a few sadists among the bunch, because there are going to be people like that anywhere. But certainly my research showed that people doing a really difficult job the best they could.
Someone asked, could you repeat the names of the 5 buildings that are still there and what they replaced or what they were?
What they were. So the Haskell building, which is right on Prince Street at you can see it sort of off 66. And it was always an administration building, but it also had treatment rooms. And I believe that patients lived there as well once they had closed Old Main. There's the coach house, which, as I said, had been a house for horses and then for automobiles. And then there are 3 residential buildings. One was the male attendants building, which is now that Columns at Rockwell Place, and that's right next to the Haskell building. And then there are 2 buildings across Village Hill Road from that. There are 2 apartment buildings, Hilltop Apartments East and West, and both of them were apartments for female nurses and employees at the hospital.
Mm-hmm. So I would ask you, Barbara, there are only 5 buildings left. Why weren't more of the hospital buildings preserved, repurposed, something?
Well, it's a very complicated subject and a sore subject with many people. Some people in town may remember there was a group of which I was a member called Save Old Main. And that was one of the buildings that we really tried very hard to save. There were other Kirkbride style buildings that have been saved around the country, but they're a very difficult building because they're built to be basically cells that are patient rooms, but they're built more like prison cells. And the state really, once it decided it was going to close it, or once it was downsizing and moving people into smaller and smaller areas of the hospital, they just abandoned things. They wouldn't even put a tarp on Old Main's roof to keep it from deteriorating. So by the time the idea for rehabilitating anything came along, things were in very bad shape, and it would have been extremely expensive to do them. Of course, all these buildings would also have lead paint and asbestos, and the state wouldn't step up, the Commonwealth would not step up to do at least the remediation, because there would have been a lot more people perhaps bidding to do the rehabilitation, the redevelopment of the hospital, if they didn't have to worry about those costs. And there was only initially one developer who, the community builders, who said they would develop the property. And again, because of those unknown risks about how much it was going to cost just to clean up the site. And as time went on, just fewer and fewer things. There was a master plan that really, I think from the beginning, they started drawing based on an empty slate. They didn't really think about this very much. And then eventually groups like Save Old Main said, well, maybe we should keep some of these buildings and try and restore them. There's also the issue that a lot of former patients and other people just couldn't be happier that Old Main was gone. And there are people I know who couldn't walk in the Haskell building because of the trauma that it caused them, because they had been treated in there. And so, some people said, well, you think of it as a beautiful Victorian brick building. That's not the way I think about it. So it was just many, many factors that caused there are just 5 buildings left.
Okay.
I've blocked.
That's why our
myself
memorial
out.
is so important.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I've blocked my picture out so I can see more of the chats.
Oh,
There's
okay.
a lot of questions. So someone wrote a correction. In fact, Jackie Duda was a special service assistant and not a nurse. Her close friend and colleague, Mary Pelis, was an LPN. And this person continued to stay in contact with Jackie and other former employees. Mary Pelis died a few years ago.
Yes,
Can anyone, another question, can anyone comment on the use of lobotomy procedures in the treatment there?
I can't, because I just don't know how it was used, if it was used, when it was used. I don't.
Yeah, it was used
They
as
weren't used, but
electric shock and insulin shock and cold baths and a lot of treatments that now seem kind of medieval to us. But again, it's what there was at that point. And I think it's, you know, it's not all that useful to blame the past for the lack of knowledge that existed. That's the way it was. In some ways, the psych meds that started really being used in the 50s, in the early 50s, I believe, were more, in some ways they were kinder, but in other ways they weren't, because they were used to the extent of people being heavily sedated. I don't really know specifically about the lobotomies.
Hey, they continue to be used in the 70s when I worked in a hospital. But David Warner commented the VA hospital in Florence had occupational farming for its residents as well. In terms of accountability for crimes, this person wrote, she knows specifically about a case of a woman case worker who stole money from patients, and she was prosecuted, convicted, and served time. Lydia Kahn says she's finishing a graphic novel about being the child of someone who was a patient at the state hospital and the perspective of the legacy of mental illness on later generations. Ed wrote, nearby Belchertown State School also had a huge farm operated by patients that were called the farm boys. Joshua wrote, Dave, keep in mind, many treatments like the asylum mothed itself, were nascent in that time. Lobectomy and ECT came nearly at the same time, followed by Thorazine. Someone wrote that Ed's book was wonderful, as Ellie stated as well. Now I got to move down because they're going off the page. And I have 5 after, so some may be leaving. We did top out 100, so my apologies if people couldn't get in. There's an effort underway to preserve a museum on the grounds of the former Belchertown State Hospital. David Warner wrote, I had a great grandparent who died at the hospital. Are there any records available? I think you sort of answered that already. Ed is saying when Belchertown closed, patient records were stored haphazardly. They're very hard to access now. Medical records and all the employees who worked in medical records have died by now. I'm looking to see if we have questions for you guys. There's more discussion. A friend who was a patient there but then resided in a halfway house said that some patients needed institutionalized care and couldn't survive outside. People said, well said, thank you. Thank you, I never knew about this before. A court order from a direct relative may be an avenue to get records. A real question is, are there any records to find? Fantastic presentation, tremendous appreciation to both of you. The late Benjamin Ricci, father of former Belchertown resident, wrote a book called Crimes Against Humanity, and that chronicles a lot. Another thank you and another thank you. So maybe we got through the questions. I hope I'm not missing anything.
Great.
It is 7 past. I'm just going to peek a little bit to make sure. I hope I got it. If I didn't, maybe people can, Nina, can people unmute themselves if I've missed a question and they're dying to ask one last question?
Now they can.
Okay.
All right.
Judy Finch is saying, thank you for your sensitive talk.
if I may.
Yes, go for it,
Yes.
wherever you are.
I just wanted to say this was really enjoyable. I'm doing a similar thing here in Augusta, Maine, with the legacy of what ended up being closed as AmHigh. Had very parallel story, very similar experiences through the whole thing. I mean, down to the memorial benches, every bit of it. And I came across this event today because I just wrote a fictional piece based on the experience of a patient. And what was the other part? Oh, another interesting part, I'm pretty sure it was the same case in Northampton. The state farm and state hospital system here, at least, made the entire hospital completely self-sufficient. But through
Yeah, at times Northampton State was self-sufficient.
Yeah.
And they sold the surplus. They sold their surplus food.
Yep. And then here, I assume it was federal, it became illegal for prisoners or, you know, people, residents, patients to live, to work. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, same thing.
Great. And I got a copy of the book also of the women. And I understand you're a Stone Coast graduate, so that's also great to hear.
Yes. Thank you, Joshua.
Okay. Have a great weekend, everybody.
You too.
I should say that you can get the book at Broadside Books and probably everywhere else by now. And it's well worth getting.
Yes.
Let's see, I have one more that just came in. Is it's true about self-sufficiency? Belchertown was a town within a town.
Well, that's what Northampton State was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We went over a bit. That was absolutely
Great.
wonderful.
Thank
I
you.
think because we had 100 people plus and we had 30 questions plus. So thank you
Okay.
very much, you guys.
Well, I
Thank
thank
you.
everybody who might still be with us and
Yeah.
glad to do it.
Yeah.
Well,
Thanks,
you still
Elliot.
have 55 people with you.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for
Okay,
joining.
bye. Thanks.